So one of the questions that came in that was framed in various different ways, but hopefully I've amalgamated it together into one relatively simple way, is the process of creating isometric exercises to focus on specific positions crucial to particular sports. And it's something that I spoke to Danny about in the podcast, and I've spoke to you, Alex, as well. So I'm going to come to you, Alex, first. What is the process that you go through when designing an exercise to fit a specific position that's relative to a specific sport or to a specific action? What do you go through? What's the process?
I think historically, if I talk about my isometric process, initially it was very much similar to probably what Danny's going to talk about in terms of a general thought process around why you implement isometric training. So it was very much around getting an exercise that can produce a really high neuromuscular output and high mechanical tension. And that being a general stimulus, which then can drive adaptations that hopefully transfer to the sporting arena or sporting movements. So that was thought process one. And I think with Danny's work, you can see quite a lot of that happening quite naturally in some of the sporting movements. But really the way I went around it was a little bit more specific. So I was very much considering, right, there's this general stimulus that will occur. That's fantastic, and that will transfer. But if I can also look at a sporting movement and find out what sort of muscle action is involved in that sporting movement, then I have a box, if you like, that I can tick. And then once I've assumed, so for example, running was one of those boxes, and that's why I've gone heavily down the run-specific isometrics. So we know, hopefully from listening to previous podcasts and the information that's out there currently, that there's some potentially quasi-isometric muscle action in the running postures and the running gaits around mid-stance. And with that in mind, that's one process box ticked from a specific implementation of isometrics. And then very much around, well, my thought process goes around what sort of muscle length is there and related obviously to the angle of different joints, and then trying to match them or become very similar to those sort of joints in the sporting movement, the joint angles in the sporting movement. And then really going down to think about what sort of forces are either needing to be tolerated or resisted in the sporting movement. And then if we can also apply that in an isometric movement, then looking further into it, what time frame do we have to produce force or resist force, if you like? And then looking further into it again, and you can see the process going through run-specific isometrics, what happens prior to producing force? So all of those processes lead me down the line of then designing exercises specific to the sporting action. In my case, going right down to the specifics of running. And really with that, I guess, if you then think about change of direction, for example, or you think about acceleration, again, my very first box to tick is the muscle action. So then does that, if I'm going down the specific route, does that take me away from acceleration and change of direction? If change of direction involves a very pronounced eccentric motion before you produce concentric forces. Likewise, is acceleration, certainly at the knee and the hip, more concentric focused? So then it tells me, am I doing this from a muscle action specific reasoning, or is it more of a general reasoning? And so in that case, absolutely, when you do, and I have done plenty of work with isometrics for vertical jumping, where maybe there's not as much as an isometric muscle action in the actual movement, but the general transfer has had an effect. So a number of different ways to look at it, really, whether you look at it from a general or a specific context.
I'll ask Danny to come in there and add a little bit of information from his work. But Alex, when you look at them number of things that you're going through, the process that you're going through, are you trying to elicit the information yourself in your own environment, or you are looking to the research, or a little bit of both?
Oh, it's certainly both. Very much research. So, you know what? It's when you get pushed down this corner and then you forget the author's name. So I won't even try and pretend. But yeah, absolutely. Looking at contact times, force, magnitude of force, angles, all of these sort of things. Really, really good PhD paper that I really sourced out to have a look at this. And again, the name escapes me, but I know Phil Graham-Smith was her supervisor. I just can't recall her name right now on the top of my head. But absolutely, yep. So there's a process, a coaching process. What do you see? What do you think? What's your gut feel? And that's originally how it started with me with one specific isometrics. And then it's research to back the progressions and where you're going to go from here, or what might be more important, or can I get better transfer? Absolutely, the research underpins that. And again, that's not research based on isometric training and its effect on running as such. It's more what are the biomechanics to the movements, what's the kinetics and kinematics, and then going from there.
I think that last point's really important as well, for people just to frame that. So Danny, coming over to you, you've shared a couple of exercises. I mean, we spoke about for your cyclists, but would you mind reiterating what you mentioned in the podcast and how you go about it specifically for that population?
Okay. In most cases, what I would do is I either work on the joint position whereby the concentric force is initiated, or the biomechanically most disadvantaged position of that particular action. So for example, if we're looking at the squat, if we go by the a parallel squat, for example, I can either get the athletes to do the isometric squat at the parallel position, or we do it at a sticking point, which is about 90 to 100 degree knee angle. Yeah. So that's some of the consideration that I have when I prescribe the position for the isometric training. Okay. And yeah, and sometimes I do what Alex does as well, getting the isometric at a very specific angle. So for example, my study on isometric training for runners, which is not published yet, what I did was I got the runners to perform the isometric mid-thigh pull at the joint angle where the foot, during the foot contact. So during the strike, where the foot is flat on the ground, and that particular joint position is where the isometric mid-thigh pull was performed for the runners. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thanks, mate. Just coming to you, Matt. I'll come back to you, Alex, in a second to add to that. Just wanted to get that from a rehab perspective, Matt. Again, similar to Danny, you've shared lots of stuff around your protocols and things. But how do you go about fitting that and making them specific to the things that the guys have mentioned?
I think all what Danny and Alex said were like really important, and you almost in a rehab situation reverse engineering some of that to think about. Then, okay, this player's injured. What are the demands of the sport we're getting the player back for? So typically in the sport that I've worked in for numerous years, football, like running and locomotion is a key part of that. So return to running is obviously that first entity of when they return to the grass. So you have to prepare them to return to run. And then obviously all those other factors that Alex talked about in terms of acceleration, etc. And then, like you talked about, change of direction, deceleration, and then football, this clearly a high amount of quasi-isometric actions take place potentially in deceleration motions. So it's thinking about the demands of the sport and then thinking about potentially what the injury is. So obviously football, hamstring injury is the most prevalent and common injury that people are always talking about. And then obviously we have this massive debate between eccentric and isometric, and that's still probably forever going to go on for a lot longer. But obviously when someone's first injured, it doesn't make sense to actually, both from a healing perspective and the perspective that the player's not ready to take them through any form of eccentric contraction. So the isometric form, obviously there's no length, there's a constant tension, there's no lengthening, and it's relatively safe. And Danny emphasized this on his podcast. It's a perfect way of sort of testing where a player may be at, particularly if obviously isometric posterior chain that we've looked at quite a bit, whether that be a monitoring tool for the healthy players, how they're responding to load. And secondly, for the returning player, importantly, if you have their pre-injury benchmark information of where they're at, that serves a vital cog in the wheel, because you're trying to get them back to that level of a function, potentially, or within that level of function before they return to on-pitch running. So the isometric, because obviously it's safe, it tells you where they were prior to being injured, is a vital cog in that wheel, but it also comes down to the demands of the sport and then reverse engineered back from what the injury is that you're looking at. Whether that be a shoulder injury, for example, if someone falls on football, you might look at Ben Ashworth's ASH test, for example, to see where they are from mine. So it all depends. It's a complex process, but it's reverse engineered what the injury is, the demands of the sport, and the demands that's going to be placed on that structure within competition.
You both, Alex and Matt, have both mentioned quasi-isometrics. I think Danny mentioned it as well. Can you give a bit of a definition of what that is, Matt, just to give people a bit of an idea if they don't know?
Oh, quasi, pseudo-isometric, false isometric. It's almost like I think it was someone doing rapid eccentrics or reflective eccentrics, which really is just a rapid eccentric movement followed by a pseudo-isometric, so a braking action that we don't know, but potentially is an isometric contraction. When you see someone stop from a large movement in sport, is there an isometric contraction there that's going on? Possibly, like Alex has mentioned in some of the locomotion. So it's that element of it. It's potentially a false isometric contraction, but there's not enough evidence or research on this yet, which hopefully people will go down in the coming years.
Cool. You've got something to add, Alex?
Yeah, I was just going to say, in terms of the transfer as well, is probably another important element that I missed out, and it's the type of isometric action you implement. So whether it's a push or a hold, for example. I always keep getting mixed up yielding and overcoming, but I, like the literature says, is a push and a hold. So I'll stick with that for now. Danny,
don't worry, Alex. We all get mixed up with that. We get confused and we think we've got it wrong, but we know what we're on about.
Yeah,
don't worry about that.
Yeah. No, great. No, great. Overcoming is a push, I'm sure. But anyway, we'll check later. So Danny does a lot of push work, right? And I thought it was really interesting in his podcast with you, Rob, where he mentioned that quite a lot of some of his studies, like of course the powerlifting study, but the kayak study and the cycling one as well, or the in-house work he's done on that, is this pushing isometrics is again trying to be concentric but unable to be concentric. And that's why Danny was mentioned, correct me if I'm wrong, Danny, that was probably a better transfer, crossover over to those sort of concentric muscular actions, if you like, in the sporting domain. Yet with running, flip that back and think holds now. So what you're trying to do when you run, you're trying to stop yourself from compressing, driving down to the ground. So what you're doing is you're doing a very different isometric action rather than a pushing one. So you're doing a holding isometric action. So the gravity, the force is coming down on you and you're resisting that force coming down on you. So they're those crossovers. And that's not to say that, when we're going down the isometric route for sporting performance, we're already becoming very, very specific if we're thinking muscle action specificity anyway. So it doesn't mean that everyone shouldn't do push work for run-specific isometrics. They should do, because there's big, high neuromuscular outputs in that push work. But also to understand that some of the best transfers that I'm starting to see is from when you move to doing your holds and then through the quasis moving forward. And another point on those quasis too, Danny made me sound far too clever talking about quasis there with a different isometric action at the hip and knee and the hip isos. I was like, I'll take it though. I'll take that. But yeah, it's not what I meant.
I know we haven't got the benefit of video and the ability to share different exercises, Alex, but with them examples that you've given, could you paint a picture of what an exercise may look like to fit into them boxes that you mentioned? Unmute.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so if we go for the knee, to keep it nice and simple, sort of a mini squat position in mid stance sort of position, and if you're pushing into an immovable bar, a bar that's far too heavy, or a racking system, that is a push, aka overcoming, I hope. And yet if you're now having a load that can move and push you downwards, you're again staying in that single leg squat position, ideally in a Smith machine, so you have some level of stability. And again, now that weight can push you down, and if it gets too heavy, it will start pushing you down. So you're counteracting it with an opposing force just to keep the bar level. Nice, easy way to sort of frame that.
Cool. Thanks, mate. Matt, anything to add?
Just to emphasize, just in terms of, we're coming back to the hamstring training, I suppose one of the big isometric exercises, the whatever you want to, the single leg Roman chair hold, or the single leg isometric hip extension that you see commonly prescribed now, which obviously I've used quite a lot in some of my in my case reports. And I think it's like perception. I see it now, like people use it, but you see people program it with the legs completely straight, when clearly that's not the aim, because you're trying to mimic that late phase of swing before you're resisting knee extension in eyesight. So and your force is going through midfoot as well, and how you put. So it's not just seeing an exercise and saying I'm doing the single leg Roman chair. It's how you coach that exercise, and then it comes down to the loading parameters that are in that. So what are you trying to achieve? Is it like isometrics? Is it pain analgesia, where it's going to be different to where it's obviously increasing stiffness, which is obviously one of the main adaptations of isometric training. But that's a good example of it, using a yielding isometric hold in a player coming back from a hamstring strain injury. And obviously you're overloading that involved limb, which obviously it makes sense to do if that's the injured limb. And secondly, you put intention through that, which obviously then you consider that if you do cyclic high strain magnitudes and repeat that in a cluster form, you actually get timed attention, and you challenge that strength endurance component that might be important to return a player after hamstring strain injury as well.
Love it, mate. Anything to add, Danny?
Oh yeah. Just to give my opinion on when I personally use the pushing and the holding method of isometric. So if my objective is actually to increase the rate of force development and the concentric, the ability to perform the concentric action, then I'll implement the pushing action, get the athlete to exert maximally and explosively. If my objective is actually to work on the eccentric strength, or with the objective of injury prevention, then my option would be using the yielding or the holding isometric method. Because if you look at some of the recently, there's actually one study that actually shows that the pushing method is kind of mimicking the concentric contraction, while the holding method seems to be more similar to eccentric contraction.
Cool. I'm gonna stick with you, Danny, if you don't mind. Just taking us on to our next point. Just want to move things along to make sure we get as much in as possible in the next 40 minutes-ish. So testing and monitoring isometrics without a force plate. That was one question that came up a couple of times in those that registered. So how would people go about that if they don't have the luxury of a force plate?
Okay. Before I answer the question, I don't get any funding and I don't get any sponsorship. All right. A cheaper method is actually a strain gauge. So if you look at it, if you just look at Alex Instagram, he actually introduced a strain gauge. Yeah. So that is a cheaper method. What it does, it can allow you to get the peak force. I don't think it allows you to get the force epoch, does it, Alex? No, right? Like,
yeah, you can get rate of force development from it, and force at certain time points as well. So,
okay.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, it depends. Yep. That's the I guess the strain gauges on steroids, which is the one I think you're referring to on my Insta page. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, a strain that strain gauge would cost a lot less than the force plate. Another device that's I think it's still under development by Force Hook. Yeah, it's a pretty cool device. But with that, you actually need a suitable squat rack. Yeah, so these are some of the options for people to go about purchase. Sorry. These are some of the equipment that people can use to replace a force plate. Yeah.
Come to you, Alex. Oh, go on, mate. Go on. Yeah, sorry, over to you, Alex. Sorry, I
Oh,
was going
sorry,
to hand it over to you, then I saw you unmute, and I thought, yeah, we'll get you in anyway. Over to you, mate.
So in terms of my isometric journey and trying to quantify and give information to people, I was very fortunate to always be around force plates and being able to quantify everything. And it's important to quantify everything so you know how hard you're working, because particularly with isometric strength and some of these movements, you can be very, very strong, yet the weight you might hold, if you don't know how strong you are, you might think you're near max and that might be enough for you, but you're probably at 60 or 70%. So actually getting the real data to know where you're at gives you much better prescription off the back of it. But I remember, I don't know, 7-8 years ago, probably because of you, Rob, and your podcast highlighting my fixation with isometrics. I would have a lot of questions about that. And the question was always, but what if you don't have a force plate? So that was a problem. It was a massive problem. And there's only so much information I could tell people to, push up against something that's immovable. If you move it, brilliant, put another 2.5 kilos on. If you move it again, put another 2.5 until you don't move it. And then that's your max value. Brilliant. And then you could work off the back of it. But that's so painstaking. So actually, funny enough, I started going down the route. And thanks to Chris Gaviglio, a guest of yours recently on the podcast, he actually suggested to me, why don't you get one of these crane scales and get it, mate? So I went right down the rabbit holes. I was in China trying to find it. I wasn't in China. I was ringing China trying to find a crane scale that would work, that would do RFD, that would give us feedback quickly, Bluetooth, all that sort of stuff. And I couldn't get it produced for a reasonable cost. So I just let it go. And then this company, Exergo, got in contact with me and said, hey, have you seen this stuff? And it was their crane scales. And I was like, that's exactly what I was trying to do for people and get out in the market. So full disclosure, I'm teamed up with them because they're a great product as well that can offer a nice, reasonably cheap solution there for everyone.
Just coming to you, Matt, I know when you're in previous positions, you probably have access to force plates. Mm-hmm. But if there's other people out there that don't, in terms of a rehab setting, is there any recommendations that you would have?
I think probably people don't think like a handheld dyno. Like if you're looking at a specific joint and you want to do it early on to see where someone's at, and you haven't got access to a force platform, where it be a permanently installed one is embedded in the floor or a portable platform, then a handheld dyno. Obviously, the problem you get with that is the issue between if it's the same person testing or another person testing, the reliability is pretty questionable. And then obviously, depending on what cohort you're working with, if you're dealing with, say, a younger person, the relative amount of force they're going to be produced and what you have to withstand is not much. But then if you get a weightlifter or a professional footballer, these guys can produce a significant amount of force. So obviously making sure that is actually a true isometric contraction without any sort of quasi-eccentric contraction as well. So there is some issues with that, which is why we switched to the portable force platform testing. And secondly, obviously we get the quality of data, not just the peak force, which is pretty reliable. Obviously familiarization with any test, but then obviously the forces at or rate of force development, however you want to term that, which obviously with sprint and ground contact times give you a bit more valuable information. But then what we found is with that, it becomes down the familiarity of the athlete to do the tests. Obviously in a rehab setting, the athlete's doing the testing more on a more frequent basis. So that quality of that data gives you a lot more quality of information rather than being noisy in a person who hasn't done it before. So it's also thinking about that. Also, whenever you put a test in, think about those pillars that obviously Robin Thorpe speaks about quite consistently, is go through that process with any test to ensure that the data you collect to inform your practice is good quality data.
Just sticking with you, Matt, and just taking it again to keeping it in the rehab setting.
Yeah.
How would you think about it when you're looking at progressions, maybe someone that hasn't done isometrics before early on in a rehab process, and then planning that throughout the allotted period of time that you think that person is going to take to get back to playing?
Yeah, I think it comes down to like with the injury, what happens, obviously you have to plan, and then like what are your conceptual goals of your rehab? Like why are you going to include isometrics? What is your because obviously we look at like Phil Glasgow's work's really good for me, like this optimal loading concept or conceptual loading, maybe that it should be called, is that what do we think theoretically is going to happen if we want to apply certain load and to maximize physiological adaptation of those injured structures and tissues? That's really what we're thinking about. once we're looking at the actual injury tissues and returning function, then we come more towards that transfer training specificity to improving performance. So return to performance side, which is obviously when the fit and healthy player's back, and that process continuing that may take up to, I know, it's an ACL 2 years after they return. So it's all those things to think about. So where does the isometrics programming fit within that conceptual loading approach that you have around the type of injury? So if we not say an ACL, for example, before they even go up to for surgery, you've got this pre-operative phase where can we use certain isometrics to maintain muscle cross-sectional area, but do it safely? Because if we put them into surgery in a better position, when they come out, we're going to be in a better position where you can crack on earlier and be more progressive. Because obviously in elite sport, you're under pressure to get a player back as quick as you can, as safely as you can. So if we can be proactive and think about strategies that we can implement with our athletes earlier, that's really important. And then when you're coming out of that, you've got years ago, RICE was the typical principle. Rest, ice, compression, elevation. And now we've moved on to this. Yeah, that's maybe a little bit too conservative. Obviously in the early stages where you've got that bleeding, edema and etc., it's not going to be like you're going to be managing the injury. But then when you come out of that, when you're going sort of through that proliferation phase, then can we apply certain types of isometric contraction, also knowing that the athlete can self-selectively apply as much force as they want to based on their injury. And then that's guiding us to how they're returning to pre-injury function based upon the data we're collecting. So it all comes down to that. So it might be with programming, for example, an ACL injury, we know there's residual strength deficits, and we know some of them precursor, we know cross-sectional area is important for force production. So we may want to put some muscle mass on a limb set of the involved limb. So can we use certain elements of yielding isometric derivatives to, obviously it's a form of blood flow restriction, which blood flow restriction, the blood pooling, that cellular swelling is a stimulus for hypertrophy, but without the load going through the joint, because the joint's obviously gone through surgery, effusion, etc. So it's all these things, like it's really complex, but all these things to think about. But the main thing is think about what are your conceptual goals of your rehab, what is the injured structure, and then what are you trying to, and where does that fit in with like the long-term process? Well, where it's early rehab before they go to that return to participation phase when they're going on the pitch. So where does it fit, and how does then that complement your other forms of muscle action in the process?
Thanks, mate. There was plenty of questions that came in on the rehab stuff, so that's framed it really nicely. Alex, anything to add there?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I was just writing some notes down there too. It's funny. Only a couple weeks ago, I mentioned potentially an intervention for a particular athlete to one of the medical staff, and immediately the thought process was, no ISOs. It's time to progress. And I was like, there's a disconnect here. The understanding that ISOs are actually really, really high force, massive neuromuscular outputs, huge mechanical strain and tension, but without all the adverse negative effects of that type of training we would get from a traditional standpoint. And so it just reminded me that very much the people in charge of early stage rehabilitation are very much focused around the tick box. This is isometric work now, because that's what we can do, but we need to move on to isotonic work quickly when we can. And actually my process, probably around a number of years back now, was actually to go, you've done all this isometric work up to this point now, got them quite strong and provided a good stimulus, and now you want me to start from scratch isotonically as you hand them over. And I'm like, well, no, I'm just going to keep on going with isometrics, because you've done so well to get them to this stage. I'll bubble along with the isotonics bit by bit. Yeah, they'll start squatting with a 40-kilo bar, slowly get up, but their isometrics are already at a certain level. So I'm just going to go. I'm just going to keep pushing it, because you've already done the great base work for me. Thank you. And then the other thing to think about, mate, is, if you believe Adrian Ly's work, and what I'm trying to say is running is isometric in nature, a large portion of it, then ultimately, if your athletes are off of running for substantial periods of time, then you should be doing isometric works to prepare them for the specificity of the muscle actions in running. And I can give you an example of how this was done to, not me, our team, done it to perfection with this Achilles rupture we had. Superstar player, Achilles rupture. He was out for 6 months. We got him back real quick. And the idea was, can we make him play the finals? Because we were going to make the finals, but there wouldn't have been enough time to reload him safely. But we just did so much isometric work all the way through his prep, not just focused on the Achilles, but all the way up the chain, that when he came back to run, we could ramp up his running so quickly. He was able to star in the finals, be best on ground, and take us as far as we could that year. And no reoccurrence, everything, because he was tolerated. He had done the running without doing the running, if you know what I mean. Okay.
Thanks, mate. Thanks, mate. Danny, we'll come to you for a final point in a second. But Matt, anything to add there?
Yeah, I just emphasise what Alex said about the isometrics, the use of it in the early stages of the rehab. I think that's what commonly people think. That's the perception, right? But it doesn't stop there. It continues through the process. Like, main adaptation that you're possibly looking to get is tendon stiffness, right? That ain't going to happen in 2 weeks. That's a long-term adaptation of this structure. It's going to take maybe 12 weeks plus to increase tendon stiffness. So if we take, don't get me wrong, high intensity eccentrics will also improve stiffness to a certain degree. So they're additive to when you combine them. But like, we had to think like, okay, our goals, and then how does that fit with, how are we going to get there? How long does that phase in? So then it comes down to, okay, how do we periodize our isometric loading in with our other type of loading? And I suppose that's, yeah, because we got this thing about tendon stiffness, probably pretty important for jump landing activities, right? So why don't we fit them too before, obviously, and maybe first down the pitch, our afternoon session is linking our isometric loading together with our jump landing preparation. And then our second day activity, we might do work on the pitch for second day, and our afternoon might be our tissue damaging stuff before they've got that third day, which is restoration. So it's where does then that fit in our programming, but continuing knowing that some of the adaptations are going to be like a long-term process rather than, okay, we do it just to, I'll get them out of pain, etc. No, it's like a tendon. Like you talked about tendinopathy. Like, what do we use it? Okay, Ebony Rio stuff around five times 45-second holds at 70% MVC. Great, gets it, but it's to get you to the dynamic part as well. It's not just to get you out of pain. It's to enable you to progress outside of that. So it's, again, what is the structure? What is your goal? And how does that all link together in the process?
Cool. Thanks, mate. Just come over to Danny. Did you have something to add there a minute ago, Danny?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we want to look at is when the training phase of the athlete. So, for example, we know that isometric poses low risk of injury, and you can pretty much increase your strength or even use it as a form of strength maintenance. So towards the competition phase, you want the athletes to maintain the strength, and you want to reduce the risk of injury. That's when you can actually implement isometric training in. That works well for that will work well for the athletes. And recently I was reading a paper by I can't remember the professor's name, pretty long. He was looking at European jumpers and tracking the European jumpers ratio of the muscle and tendon function, Achilles tendon function. And what they found was that the ratio changes throughout the training phase, and the ratio increased during phases where resistance training was reduced. So the athletes were performing a lot of ballistic training, jumping, plyometrics, but there was a lack of resistance training. And so the muscle functioned a lot better than the tendon. So I think in these cases, where athletes are trying to reduce heavy lifting, that's when they can implement some isometric training as well, because it's not as fatiguing, it's less time consuming. Contract 30 seconds, that's it, go back to your go back to your plyometric training. That will help with the improving the function of the tendon, like what Matt said. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks, mate. Alex, did you have anything to add there, or has Danny covered that?
I think Danny, it's fascinating, this morphological change in the tendon, just like Matt said, takes forever, but it does get there, it does change. But I just can't help, and I can't back this up by any science, so I was going to try and hijack you and ask a question to Danny, but we see some we often see some changes, maybe not all the way through to the muscle tendon level, but we certainly see that there are stiffness changes in some of the jump characteristics so an output measure of stiffness, if you like, quite quickly in the process. So it's not necessarily change it morphologically at the tendon level, but I just wonder what Danny might have to say on that, because with his runners, for example, his recent running study, it was only a 6-week. Danny just does 6-week studies, you see, because he's that good with isometrics, whereas we have to do years and years of stuff to make a change. But anyway, I wonder if Danny has something to add on that point.
Well, unfortunately, I did not do any measurement for the morphological changes like ultrasound scan and stuff like that. First, I don't have the equipment and I don't really have the expertise to accurately diagnose the changes. But what I'll refer to a few studies by Kubo, Japanese scientist. He actually did a lot of isometric studies, and he actually looked into the morphological changes. In one study, he actually compared the plyometric and isometric training, and what he found was that the tendon stiffness was changed in isometric training, but not with plyometric. But plyometric actually changed the active stiffness of the whole muscular tendon system during activity, but that did not really change much in isometric. So based on my study, what I found was what I thought was that we know if we want to increase the utilization of the elastic energy from tendon, we want the tendon to be stiff. So when you stretch the tendon, the recoil will be greater, right? So with plyometric, they increase the stiffness of the muscle, but not the tendon. So what happened was the tendon was able to be stretched while the muscle is able to be stiff. So maintaining the stiffness of the muscle allows the tendon to be stretched further, and that allows for greater recoil. While for isometric, they increase the tendon stiffness, but the ratio to the increase in tendon stiffness and increase in muscle stiffness was not proportional, maybe in a way to say that. So tendon stiffness was great. Tendon stiffness increment was great, and muscle stiffness increment, active stiffness increment wasn't as great to allow the muscle to maintain that stiffness for the stiff tendon to stretch to a greater length. You get what I mean? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that was why in that study, they did not see an increment in the stretch shortening cycle. Sorry, the improvement in the stretch shortening cycle function for the isometric training. So theoretically speaking, if plyometric training is good at improving the active stiffness of the muscle, and isometric training is good with increasing the stiffness of the tendon. So if you combine them together, you pretty much have a perfect training. Well, that's theoretically speaking, but again, we need more experimental studies on that.
Cool. Thanks, Danny. Appreciate that. Matt, anything to add?
Well, just Danny's point? How we talked about the complementary use of obviously biometrics and isometric like focus training. In the semimembranosus reconstruction paper that we published, obviously we measured counter movement jump data with that player, and obviously those two components were a big part of his like periodized plan, and like not directly measuring those, but when you looked at his changes, like circa the CM depth, the counter movement depth got shorter, and his eccentric rate of force development was enhanced, giving that indication of, and obviously a reduction in flight time, contraction time because of that reduced counter movement depth and eccentric duration, which will give you the notion of an improved like stretch shortening cycle capability based upon that training effect, although it wasn't actively measured, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, I'm just going to remind people to pop your questions if you've got any in the chat box, and we'll come to those in 5 or 10 minutes. But one question that came up a couple of times again in those that registered, Alex, was isometrics in younger populations. And I'd spoke to Luke Jenkinson at Derby about this. I know you spoke to him at certain points over the last couple of years about this. But why would somebody use isometrics in a younger population? And what are your thoughts on it? Unmute. Yes.
So with youth or adolescents or academy aged, look, again, traditional training, I think, is completely, the number one. Get them doing their traditional training and almost earning the right for more of this type of work. But if we are implementing isometrics, again, if you're looking at it from a specific running side of things, then starting with longer time under tension. So it's where I break my rule. So I tend not to do anything longer than 10 seconds. I just I add weight and get higher intensity and shorten the durations and then work on, rate of force development and other things like this and some more quasi-isometrics and so on. However, with the younger athletes, I break the rule there completely and give them longer time under tension with less load and just take my time with holds, start measuring something with the pushes to see where they're at, to then give them some level of quantification of loads. I still whether the pushers tell me that they're really strong isometrically, I still probably don't necessarily go down the route of loading them up heavy. I still am working with the traditional training as a general philosophy, and we're working from 30 seconds kind of thing down to 25, 20, 15, 10 until we get into the zones, and that might take years rather than months as such. However, caveat. So with your athletes, some athletes, I worked in an academy that we have to push athletes and get them ready, right? So now either we were going to try and get them to squat 2 times body weight and push them into that as hard as we could and as fast as we could by the time they're 15, and we did successfully at some stages. But other times that just comes at far too much of a risk. But they're a higher performing athlete. They're not elite yet, they're not senior, but they're on a pathway, and sometimes they need to achieve certain things as they go through. So actually isometrics becomes a very safe way of getting maximal neuromuscular outputs with them. So then you can shift that mindset as well in that case. It is a high performing junior athlete that's on a pathway. Well, then let's get load out of them this way rather than trying to double bilateral squat. And we'll keep on that journey with a bilateral squat or a deadlift or whatever. But this is one that we can go, boom, jump up here straight away and start putting massive stress through the musculature and the nervous system. But again, in this case, rather than holding heavy weights, let's push. So then you're always in charge of your output, if you like. So then we can get them to push into objects rather than hold heavy weights as such. So that's another thing to consider. I guess another one is, say, for instance, an academy-aged athlete now in a pro academy. They're still, they've survived on talent, a lot of them, rather than necessarily being physical weapons. So with this in mind, we can also consider, look, loads are going to go through the roof now. They're going to be playing, pro level games, whether that's second division or under 21s or whatever sport you're working with. Everything's going to ramp up massive. There's the demands on them going to ramp up. The stress is going to ramp up. The physical stress is going to ramp up. The loading on the field and so on is going to ramp up. So actually, do you want to then go and do more and more plyometrics? And do you want to go and do more and more heavy lifting? And do you want to put them at a bigger risk? Or do you want to go switch your mindset over to isometrics a bit more? And that can be your key focus, your key driver as you tick along the process of development over the years with this academy age player. So multiple ways of looking at it there. So what I'm essentially saying is exercise care and caution. With my progressions, if you look at them or you see my progressions, there's no need to go to the full length of them. You're already being specific in terms of running by doing my isometric training. So you can just play the long game. And again, the flip is, if you need to get that stimulus for a performance reason, there's a safe and effective way to do that as well.
Thanks, mate. Like I said, there was quite a few questions that came in, so I think that'll tick a lot of boxes for people on this call. Matt, with your experience of working with female athletes, does it make any difference? Are we taking other things into consideration when it comes to isometrics or not?
Not really. I think the big one, like, if you're going to use some of the yielding variations, you're going to use them away from like the concentric side and developing rate of force development comes further down the process, say with an ACL. If you're going to look at, say, cross-sectional area and those things, like holding yielding isometrics when it becomes, say, loaded yielding versions is quite mentally challenging. Like, do they have the concentration and the focus to actually do that? That's one big thing that I would say around that. And that probably transfers to a younger athlete as well. Do they have the level of emotional maturity to do these types of contractions? Because when we think about the adaptations we're trying to get, apart from obviously those cross-sectional areas where lower ones driving that blood flow restriction response, these are obviously the ones that are concentrically focused are above probably 70% of maximal effort where you're going to get the adaptations. So it's making sure the athlete buys into that approach and gives you like full intent. That would be one of the big things to say. And then obviously with any type of training, it's that diminishing returns as well. Like you only get so much until you progress. So it's important, like know where you're at, progress that. And it will be the same.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Just excuse me, sticking with you, Matt. Last point before we dive into a couple of questions that have popped up in the chat. Again, stick them in now. We can get to them, but make sure you direct them at someone so I know who you want to answer that. And we've mentioned this a couple of times, Matt. Fitting isometrics in a wider program, and we've got the title as science and application of isometric training, but it's important to know that this fits into a wider program. So I just want to kind of put that back to you, as you've mentioned it a couple of times, just to probably reiterate that.
Of course, like say if you're looking at it from a fit and healthy player, like a professional footballer, how does that fit? Are they doing some form of, obviously we know about overcoming ISOs. They're central nervous system like challenging. So that's really a form of potentiation in effect. So can they use like a small amount of these elements in their pre-training preparation before they're going out? Because they're priming the nervous system without the energetic costs that would be of maybe heavy slow resistance training. So where does that fit into like your pre-training prep? Then obviously when they're doing their strength programming, where does that fit in with their, I'd say, high-speed running exposure in the week and the game model of the coach? So it's planning around, like, again, communication with what's the bigger global program, because obviously Alex made this, like the amount of training stress that these players go through on an elite level is huge. So where does this fit into the programming? And when they're going through, say, 2 games a week or whatever, can you use these tools? Because we know they're less energetic. We don't have to program mass volumes potentially to tap into the nervous system. So it's fitting that in and around the program. And then obviously the injured athlete, it's obviously what is the conceptual goal? As I mentioned, say the structure, say it's a bone injury, then we know for the literature around bone injury, we know that bones respond best to dynamic loading and jump loading rather than isometric contractions. But the isometric contraction serves the muscle function side to get them into good positions where it may be a return to running. So they complement each other. That's the big thing to think about. It's not one in isolation. It's how they fit together in this jigsaw to get the player back to sport, back to team training from a rehab perspective.
Cool. Thanks, mate. Nice way to finish off before we dive into questions. So again, if anyone's got any, pop them in the chat. So next 8 or 9 minutes on some questions before I let these guys go and crack on with what's left of their Sunday. So question for Alex: how do you implement isometric testing into a profiling hierarchy? Are you all right taking that?
Yeah, I'll just try and be quick, knowing that you've got, we've only got 9 minutes and it looks like there's 12 or so questions. So just really quickly, without, so I do ankle, hip and knee. If they're big squads, it's problematic, it's difficult, but we do them as a priority because they're really important from a return to play side of things and also for being able to quantify loads. With force plates, it becomes difficult and arduous. With gadgets like the one mentioned before from Exergo and the like, then that becomes a really simple process because I can get 3 or 4 of them out and measure people as we go. So I guess, and the main thing, because peak force is the most reliable, that's the main thing we look at. But when we're training, certainly we look at rate of force development and force at different time points, and we use the outputs to be able to, give people that sort of, I guess, that direct, I guess, quantification of what they're doing as such. I hope that answers your questions, but yeah, we've got our stretch shortening cycle assessments. You've got your concentric only type assessments. You've got your max force assessments at different joints. We still do, well, actually, no, depending on where I'm at, we do some isometric hip pulling still, just because those numbers are so readily available to the community. We know what good is, what bad is, whereas the data on run specific isometrics is growing more and more as we, as more and more people adopt it. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
cool. I've just seen the amount of questions. I didn't actually look it up at the top, but we'll probably won't be able to get through all questions. But there's one for Danny, and feel free to jump in, Alex and Matt as well. Are you combining exercises of isometrics with plyos in a complex method? That's Vangelos.
Yep. Okay. It really depends on which training phase I'm in. If, say, my focus at that point of time is just maximum strength, what I would usually do is I'll halve the volume of dynamic version of that exercise, and then I'll replace it with the isometric version of it. And usually it will either be at the joint position where the concentric phase is initiated, or the sticking point of that particular exercise. I do the contrast training as well. So what I did usually do is three repetition of the maximal isometric contraction, followed by a set of 5 jumps, for example. Yeah,
Okay.
And that's usually closer to competition.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, mate. Just one for Alex, and I'll get Matt's opinion on this as well. And again, this may be covered, so please bear with me. What stages would you implement more or less isometric training based on competition? I'll come to you, Alex, first. Is there any stages of the annual plan that you would implement ISOs more than others based on your competition season? No.
Yeah, definitely. In competition, there's a lot more isometric work. It depends again what sport we're talking about. In track and field, the sprinters, absolutely. Like there's been sprinters where that's been their work, plyos and isos, and that's it. No traditional lifting as such, but that was very unique circumstances and very unique athletes too. So rather than blanket rule it, I would just say it depends. It depends on the situation and the athlete. But yeah, certainly towards competition phases, isometric work is a fantastic way to be able to get a really high stimulus and not have the undue fatigue. Having said that, I have, for really high neural output guys, fast twitch fiber guys that can really put out high, so some sprinters, Bob Skeleton athletes, those sort of things, they can absolutely ruin themselves off of 1 or 2 really high intensity reps, maximal all out reps of isometric pushing. So you have to be careful of the athlete. And so what I do with those guys is, instead of going for a 2 or 3 second maximal output, I go for half second. Right, you're going to get tension out of whatever position it's in, get a bit of tension into the bar, so all the slacks out of the system, and then you're going to go hard and then back off completely. And then that keeps them fresh, that has them fired, and they don't fatigue so much. Most average Joe blogs and team sports are absolutely fine to do maximal isometric contractions and be fine and recover quickly off the back of it.
Matt, coming to you, and just one of these questions, and we're getting into the weeds here, we're getting into the super specific details, but would these kind of exercises come right at the start of a session, or would they be somewhere in the middle?
It will depend entirely on like what type of isometric derivative you're using. So potentially, if it was obviously the overcoming, which are more central nervous system focus on concentric focus, they probably come more at the start of the session, because you're generally in a fresher state at the start of the session. And then I suppose the ones that are more to get that stimulus of like submaximal holds, longer duration, you're trying to drive restriction and that side of it in terms of a volume response. Then I guess they're going to go towards the end of the session, like you would program blood flow restriction training, because you're going, because they're quite fatiguing. They're quite draining neuromuscularly and anyway, because you're holding something for a long time. So the time and attention is long. So they're going to become at the end of the session. So it comes down to what's the type of exercise you're going to use, why you're going to use it, and then where does that fit in with your within session programming. And then obviously the rest periods in between are obviously going to influence that. So if it's something that's highly central nervous system draining, then you're going to have longer rest periods in between, because you want them to repeat those intensities when they do it again, rather than, okay, or if they're working on the repeatability and the fatigue, they might, it's that depends, which is probably not the perfect answer that no one wants to hear, but that's what you're dealing with when you're working with athletes and you're trying to individualize a program.
Alex, anything to add there?
Yeah, I thought I just know that this is a question that comes all the time. You're like, how do I do it? Yeah, great, thanks for all that information, but how do I do it? So I just wanted to hijack it again and just to try and help and shed more light as well on it. So look, I often find myself using it in team sport environments as microdosing quite a lot. So I know Matt mentioned earlier on, some analgesic effect or some sort of therapeutic response early after games. So games played, 2 days later, we're getting some loading in, but it's therapeutic loading, holding isometrics or pushing isometrics, so less eccentric type work, pushing, and it's really contained intensities. You get a great feeling off the back of it. Boys aren't as sore anymore. We've got a load in too. And then you've got your pre-training analgesic effect for normally the tendon boys, but we can easily get everyone doing it to get another dose. And then you've got your main effect on the main training day, the main gym session. And no one has to go crazy and think, oh no, I can't squat and I can't clean anymore because I've got to do isometrics first. Actually, a really good way to warm up for your isometrics is to go do a blooming heavy squat, a double or a triple, like warm up to it, get a good one on your back, because you're going to be putting 5 to 6 times body weight loads if you're doing a one leg isometric squat position through your back anyway. So that squat doesn't even compare. It's actually a good warm up. So you don't actually have to let these things go. You can do power exercise too, jump squats, warms you up for your isos. Then they're the big neuromuscular driver, hit them really, really hard. And just like Matt said too, you've got your supportive isos at the back end of it, where you might go for longer duration stuff, a bit more of a tissue type focus where you might do holding work as such. And then later in the week, captain's run, for example, game -1, 24 hours before a game, you might have a priming session there where you might have rate of force development isometric focuses in that, because you got nothing in terms of neuromuscular fatigue, but a nice heightened neuromuscular sense off the back of it. And then even game day warm up in the sheds doing stuff. You can do isometric stuff there and then go out and play. You microdosed it 4 or 5 times in the week. Depending on who the athlete is, you don't really have to do much more. Do your key hammy eccentric work and all that, of course, but it's actually a good way to get it all in. So you can look through all of that and find out ways you can implement it if you like.
Love that. Thanks, mate. Danny, were you going to add anything there, or was that covered?
No, yeah, covered. Alex said it.
Okay. No worries, mate. One last one. It might be a quick one, just to see us out on the hour. How would you prescribe load for a yielding isometrics? Would it be percentage of body weight or rep max? Alex, that came to you, but
yeah, I'll go real quickly on that.
Yep.
Again, if you can get an output and measure it, which again, it's available to you now. Everyone can get it. So get that output, measure it, find out what you are. So there's, if you're putting out 1,000 Newtons, and then my heaviest yielding work will start touching 75 to 80% of that output, okay? Factor in body weight and stuff too, depending on how you're measuring it. If you're on a force plate, you've got to minus your body weight, okay? Otherwise you'll be lifting weights too heavy. But the yielding, I generally put yielding, if it's not therapeutic doses or longer duration holds, if it's, again, like my system sort of dictates, 10-second as maximum holding, well, then we're working from sort of 60%, maybe as low as 50 to 80% when we're just holding it for a really short duration, really high intensity work. Some people can't get to 80%, I must say, and it's around 70, 75 for them. So there's the range. I hope that answers the question quickly.
Absolutely. No, thanks, mate. I hope people understand that we're at the hour, so I want to let you guys go and get on with what's left of you Sunday. So I'll make a note of all these questions that have come in, because there's quite a few we haven't, there's probably 10 that we haven't quite got to. Hopefully there's something in the future that we can answer them along the way. But I really appreciate people tuning in. It was 100 at its peak, which is great. And thank you for everyone for sticking around. But biggest thanks to Matt, Danny, and Alex for giving up some of their Sunday to have a chat. It's been fascinating. I think there'll be the rehab guys, the youth guys, the team sport guys, all got plenty of info there. So really appreciate your time, and we'll all catch up soon.